Hello there, I'm David Outridge. I'm an addiction medical specialist working in Newcastle, and this is a series of seminars on addiction, and I hope they'll help you to navigate quite a vexing issue in our society. Despite everything we know, there are many mysteries that remain, and addiction is still quite a human condition. So whilst this may help you to navigate the system and to work out where you should be putting your efforts with your loved one, it by no means answers some of the many issues that we face when dealing with people with addiction. In this first talk, I propose to look at the criteria for addiction, how to recognise addiction, look at the brain and habit formation, how substances produce addiction, and who is at risk of addiction. And recognising at this stage that addiction not only applies to substances but also certain behaviours such as gambling, gaming and internet addiction. Possibly also applies to sexual addiction and pornography, buying or shopping addiction, workaholism, even exercise, and possibly what they call love addiction or an addiction to people. So the key features of addiction in the latest manual of diagnostic psychiatric diagnoses, there are 11 criteria listed for addiction, and I've like to group these into three groups, which makes it easier to understand and conceptualise. But the first group of symptoms that indicate addiction would be a loss of control of substance use, and this may be indicated by when someone goes to use a substance, they end up using a lot more and for a lot longer than they intended. Another feature might be that despite knowing the harm it's causing physically and psychologically, a person will continue to use it. And despite certain adverse social situations like disinhibition and possibly embarrassment, people continue to use it. And also repeated attempts to cut down unsuccessfully. So these are symptoms of loss of control. The second group of symptoms which indicate addiction is really about problems that arise from addiction and objective evidence of those problems. These could be such things as hazardous use in hazardous situations, such as driving, smoking in public transport where you may be fined for doing so, and that sort of thing. Other objective evidence of problems might be neglect of roles and responsibilities, such as parenting, work roles, etc. Then there may be problems with interpersonal relationships, that is social problems arising. And then just the sheer amount of time that a person might spend obtaining the drug or substance, using it and recovering. So these are objective evidence of problems associated with substance use. And then there's the third category, which I call subjective issues, subjective feelings, which include the feeling of craving, and craving could be described as having a feeling for the substance that is overpowering, that you can't think of anything else at the time until that feeling is satiated. Other symptoms, other feelings that people may have is that the drug doesn't give the same effect, so there's a greater quantity needed for the same effect. That's called tolerance, and that going without the drug can cause, if you like, reverse of the symptoms that the drug causes. So that's a withdrawal symptoms. Now, these last two features do not apply to prescribed drugs, which obviously can do the same sort of thing. People can require a larger quantity of, say, a sedative or an antidepressant for it to achieve the optimal effect, and people can have withdrawal symptoms from those prescribed medications. So this third group does not apply to a prescribed medication. And for the criteria of addiction to be, or a substance use disorder is the latest terminology, to be considered present, at least 2 symptoms would constitute a mild addiction or a mild substance use disorder, and about 4 would be moderate, 6 would start to be in the severe category. So what I'd like to try to get you to understand through this next series of slides is the brain's tendency to habit formation and how that is actually a normal process that substances tend to hijack. We'll also look at brain regions and how substances affect various brain regions and their role in the addiction. The first section, I'm going to just play a video about Pavlov, who discovered, or who really documented what we know intrinsically is associative learning. That is, we tend to associate things that occur together, which seems quite obvious, but it's a very important part of our brain's function. So I'll just play this short video. It goes for a couple of minutes.
Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened.
So this video, it may seem irrelevant, but it's actually quite important in understanding addiction and understanding what triggers people to seek drugs. And importantly, it's mentioned there not only the acquiring of a learned association, but the gradual fading out of that learned association over time. Let's look at that in how that applies to humans or animals. So we have a basic need such as thirst, and naturally drinking water feels good. That creates a good feeling. That is not something you need to learn. When we drink water, we get a natural surge of feeling good. But in order to survive, we would have to learn where that water comes from. And so through observation, at the time of drinking water, the animal or person may see that a tap is involved. and the surroundings involving a tap. And so when the person is thirsty in future, they are attracted to the tap. So the tap itself becomes an attraction. So when a person is thirsty, they look for a tap. It seems too obvious to be worth mentioning, but this is a powerful mechanism in the brain which we all need to survive. And this mechanism is actually brought about through chemical processes in the brain. So, and we'll see that how substances can hijack those chemical processes. The other thing about association is the acquisition of learning. So, for example, again, taking that idea of thirst as the basic need, a tap is present. So a child may have seen somebody turning the tap on, or may have just started doing trial and error, turning the tap on, gets water, gets the thirst relieved, that pleasure, and that reinforces that behaviour. So this illustrates a very fundamental type of learning in the brain. Not a high-level learning, but a very basic learning which is involved with survival, which involves an activator such as thirst, a behaviour which can be experimentally learned or just observed, and a consequence which will be either a reinforcing or a negating consequence. That consequence then reinforces the behaviour if it resulted in a pleasure, and that is then tends to keep that behaviour going in future. This mechanism of reinforcing behaviours is mediated through dopamine, a chemical in the brain. We'll go on to see how that happens. So in nature, an example from nature, a lion experiences hunger. It's observed a behaviour with its parents or its other lions that waiting near a waterhole at sunset catches prey. I'm just assuming that's how they do it. And the result is that hunger is satisfied, and that causes a surge of dopamine in the brain that reinforces that behaviour. And without that basic mechanism of acquiring associations and learning behaviours, we simply wouldn't survive. Animals wouldn't survive in nature. And this applies to a lot of our basic needs, not just hunger and thirst, but safety and also reproduction. It's obviously not as simple as life isn't as simple as just having an urge, meeting that with a certain behaviour, and then without some sort of modification of that whole system. And that's where the smart brain comes in. So this kind of learning happens at a very basic level in the brain, which is common to animals in the animal kingdom, but as the more sophisticated animals' behaviour is, the more important is that other factors kind of moderate those basic triggers and the basic behaviours. Otherwise, we would take a dislike to someone and just go and, attack them or just take what we wanted without consideration of other people. So going on from there, we're just going to talk about the brain and the smart brain and the animal brain. So we have a part of our brain which is a fairly prototypical part of the brain called the limbic system, and I like to call it the animal brain. And then a more advanced part of the brain, if you like, as modifications have occurred, which is the cerebral cortex. And the very front part of this is called the frontal lobe. Parts of the cerebral cortex, including vision, occur here. On the other side of that is motor and speech. That is movement and speech, coordination. Also in that part is to do with spatial planning, all these kind of very high-level computing functions. But the frontal lobe is where our highest level of thinking occurs. The frontal lobe is really, say, the executive in an organisation. So just say you were going to catch a ball was coming towards you. your visual cortex, or visual part of the brain, would be computing. The side part of your brain, called the parietal part of your brain, would be doing virtually huge mathematical computations to allow you to catch that ball. But the frontal lobe would be more to do with, should I catch the ball? Can I catch the ball? And to what effort would I put into catching that ball? So if you were playing a test match in cricket, your executive part of your brain would probably tell the rest of your brain, right, this is an all-out. We've got to catch that ball and throw everything into it to the extent that you might actually injure yourself. Whereas if it was a situation where it wasn't that important, then the executive part of your brain might decide, no, I'll just make an average effort. So the executive part of your brain, or the frontal lobe, is very important in high-level functioning. The animal part of your brain is to do with those basic drives and really actually powers up the rest of the brain. Animal brain is very similar to those of the animal kingdom. Conceptually, we can think of the animal brain as like our inner caveman. It's where drives for food, security, sex, control, power reside, and it is modulated down by the smart brain, where higher levels of social considerations come in. But the animal brain actually does give emotional content to what goes on in the smart brain. So it gives emotional content to our thoughts, to images, sounds, memories, and to even higher concepts like justice, altruism, or social concerns. The frontal lobe is not entirely unique. Apes have a degree of frontal lobe. Lower animals have a very rudimentary frontal lobe. But frontal lobe of humans is evidently able to do a lot more than or do things differently to other animals, whose brain is more adapted to their instinctive behaviours. So a dog's thought life would revolve around smells, dog hierarchy, getting food, and that kind of thing. But we have seen that monkeys are quite capable of things that we're not capable of. For example, they can keep track of a large series of numbers for a reward, and this may be a specialised feature for keeping track of where the whole monkey tribe is in a fast-moving situation where they're escaping a predator. They can show quite complex social behaviour and play, but they'll never really be able to understand poetry or philosophy or moral dilemmas. So the human brain has that additional ability which makes us unique in the animal kingdom. It allows us to make complex judgments and adapting to change. So in summary, the frontal lobe is the smart brain. It's like the executive part of the brain. It controls the rest of the brain. And just like in a company, that's where the corporate identity or the person's identity resides, weighing up different judgments, managing competing concerns, and really adapting to change. So, for example, if a company didn't adapt to change, they would cease to exist. They would be overtaken by another company. So adaptation is a key feature of the frontal lobe. Now, just to put it into a picture, which I think is always handy, the animal brain is very much like the relationship between the smart brain and animal brain is like a man riding a horse or a person riding a horse. Together they're a unit, but the horse is providing that power, agility and energy, whereas the rider is in control and providing direction. So the smart brain in the ideal world is in control of the animal brain. Just a word on the frontal lobe, which the frontal lobe is really the most complex thing in the universe, and it takes quite a long time to develop. To raise a human takes into the 20s, and you could say their maturity continues to develop over time. It plays a key role in modifying our responses and living in a complex society. Now, problems can arise through heredity or developmental adversity. So, for example, an infection early in life or in the uterus, mental health problems and injuries or even diseases. And so if the frontal lobe is damaged in some way, you can imagine that the way the organism functions as a whole, the way the brain functions as a whole is not in balance. The frontal lobe is, if losing control, means that the animal brain will tend to be more in control. So how do substances produce addiction? This picture is actually a picture of nerve cells in a petri dish. They naturally branch out and connect to each other. There are tens of thousands of connections within each nerve cell in the brain, and then there's so many billion nerve cells. So you can imagine how many, if you multiply those together, how many billion connections there are in the brain. And those connections really are what give us that ability to associate things, remember things, and those connections are either strengthened or weakened depending on what happens in the brain. So we'll just go on to look at the chemical basis of learning, learning of associations and behaviours, dopamine levels, and what happens to these learned associations in addiction. I'm going to play another little video, which some of the terminology may be a bit unfamiliar, beyond us, but I think you'll get the idea of the role of the animal brain and dopamine in the acquisition of learning.
The limbic system contains the brain's reward circuit or pathway. The reward circuit links together a number of brain structures that control and regulate our ability to feel pleasure. Feeling pleasure motivates us to repeat behaviors, such as eating, and other actions that are critical to our existence. A reward, or something linked with a reward, activates cells in the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, in the midbrain. This sets off a chain reaction of activation in the reward circuit. The activation of cells quickly reaches a key part of the VS called the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is often called the brain's pleasure center. When activated, each cell generates an electrical signal. That electrical signal causes the cell to release molecules of neurotransmitter, which act as chemical messengers. Those chemical messages are received by another cell. This is how cells communicate with each other in an activated neural circuit. In the reward pathway, dopamine neurons release the neurotransmitter dopamine. The released dopamine molecules drift across the synapse. They link up with proteins called dopamine receptors on the surface of the receiving cell. These receptors span the receiving cell's membrane, with part on the outside and part on the inside of the cell. In a healthy brain, there is always a moderate level of dopamine in the synaptic space, even in the absence of rewarding stimuli. When a reward is encountered, such as food, the presynaptic cell releases a larger amount of dopamine in a sudden burst. Dopamine transporters will then quickly remove the excess, returning the amount of dopamine to the original level. Dopamine surges in response to natural rewards help the brain learn, adapt, and navigate a complex world. Activation of the reward pathway has a far-reaching impact throughout the brain. From the VS, the reward pathway extends to the prefrontal cortex, or PFC. The PFC powers our ability to think, plan, solve problems, and make decisions. The reward system influences the limbic system and the areas of the cortex that process sensory and motor information. Reward system activation also influences the cerebellum in the back of the brain, which affects coordination of movement as well as attention. Normal activation of the reward system creates a physical imprint on the brain that links certain stimuli with rewards that satisfy biological needs, such as food, and make us want to fulfill those needs by seeking out those rewards. Once the brain associates a stimulus with a reward, just seeing the stimulus can trigger a surge of dopamine in the reward system.
So that's a little bit complicated, but it demonstrates well that dopamine, which is associated with pleasurable responses, activates the whole brain and, if you like, causes like a snapshot of that situation, which allows learning. So the visual images that the brain's seeing, position, the place, the location, and obviously the cause of the pleasurable stimulus and everything associated with it is snapshot, and those associations strengthen. Those associations strengthen as increased strength of nerve connections. We saw those little nerve cells naturally reaching out and connecting to each other, and certain connections which are repeatedly activated actually make a physical connection stronger. The actual little nerve terminal nerve connection becomes stronger. The strength of dopamine release, if you've seen how the amount of dopamine actually causes that imprint, and there are some different. This is a slide of some different things that can release dopamine, such as food. Nicotine's a bit higher. Morphine's up there somewhere. Sex is somewhere in there, probably around the same level as food. But this dark blue line is actually cocaine. So it shows how it's much higher than other naturally occurring or other drugs. And the purple line is actually from methamphetamine. So we're seeing a release of dopamine which is 10 times the amount which you receive in a naturally occurring reward. Because there's such a large amount of dopamine, the amount of reinforcement, the amount of the snapshot, if you like, is not just a snapshot, but it's almost imprinted in the brain. And we can see from that the learning around drug use can be very profound. Let's look at a situation from our everyday experience. Fast food chains like us to spend their money there, and so they realise that by making the food very tasty, a bit salty, a bit extra sugar, they can make it very pleasurable. So people enjoy a Big Mac as opposed to just a salad. That extra taste and the stimulation it causes heightens the amount of dopamine that's released, and that reward is quite high. So what the company does is associate that with these markers, such as the big yellow M, which is displayed so you can see it from hundreds of metres away, certain colour-coordinated themes. And so when you drive past a McDonald's, you tend to get that associated learning, your mouth starts watering, and you think about having a burger or a coffee. So that's probably what we are familiar with. In the drug-using world, different sort of associated stimuli are present. So the sight of the paraphernalia used to use drugs, the sight of money in one's wallet, a certain street location where drugs are procured, inner feelings such as the withdrawal symptoms, running into people, the day of the week. So payday is a typical, or a Friday night is a typical trigger. And these associated stimuli become very powerful. We saw how in Pavlov's experiment that those associations can diminish over time, and we call that extinction. But these things take quite a long time to go away, and this is part of the recovery process, is waiting long enough for those associations to fade. Now, with a well-functioning frontal lobe, we can resist. We know that we need to lose weight. We drive past McDonald's and don't have the hamburger we don't need. But if you imagine that that the stimulus to get that reward is much, much higher, it will be that more difficult to drive past. And the other effect of substances is on the frontal lobe. This next video, it's a curious little video, but it does illustrate well that the fact that the frontal lobe depends on dopamine stimulation for it to light up and to function. So I'll just play this.
This is your brain. Here are the neurons that produce dopamine. When these neurons are activated, they release dopamine here in the frontal lobes. Dopamine is motivation. When dopamine is released, you feel motivated to keep on doing whatever it is you're doing. Dopamine is what makes things seem important and meaningful. Your frontal lobes are where thoughts are formed. If your frontal lobes are low on dopamine, you get bored and start looking for something that can stimulate your dopamine neurons to release more dopamine into your frontal lobes. Food, drink, sex, social pleasure, and addictive drugs activate dopamine neurons directly. That's why they can be so addictive. Interesting sights and sounds can also activate dopamine neurons. That's why you're still watching this video. The frontal lobes themselves can form a positive feedback loop with the dopamine neurons. This is called thinking. Very few people can form feedback loops like that without thinking. That's called meditation, and it's really difficult. Most people need to think about something interesting, something they're doing or looking at, or something that's happened to them in their lives, and plans and hopes they have for the future. That's why we never stop thinking. Our frontal lobes are drawn to whatever thought releases most dopamine. That's also how long-term thinking and self-discipline works. We use our frontal lobes to activate our dopamine neurons even when what we're doing is boring or difficult. People vary in how well their frontal lobes can activate their dopamine neurons. People with attention deficit disorder or addiction have great problems with it, and most of us find it difficult to go for a salad and supply our own dopamine rather than having a burger or a cake, which activate dopamine neurons directly.
Just going to stop it there. So this just indicates that not only is dopamine part of the reinforcing part of our animal brain, but it also actually lights up the rest of our brain, particularly the frontal lobe. And where that dopamine is deficient, and a key example of that would be attention deficit disorder in children, then the rest of the brain tends to just run amok, and the individual doesn't show a lot of restraint, thus the hyperactivity. But we'll see in the next slide that it can occur in substance use as well. So, when dopamine is released excessively for long periods of time, there's actually a diminution in the dopamine activity. The actual nerves can be damaged by too much dopamine. Particularly with methamphetamine, because it releases dopamine into the nerve from little envelopes where it's protected from the cell into the cell, and that causes damage to the cell. So this shows a scan where a tracer which attaches itself to dopamine neurons lights up, and this is a person who's never used methamphetamine. This is a person who's chronically used methamphetamine, so you can see that it's become less. Now, in relation to the frontal lobe function, scans have been correlated with the amount of dopamine receptors that light up and certain tasks. One is a motor task. This could be responding to stimuli using your hands. This one is a memory task. And this simply shows that the less you've got of these dopamine receptors, the longer it takes you to do either a motor task, or that is a manual task, or a memory task. So what that means is that people who've used methamphetamine chronically, their frontal lobes aren't functioning as well. And it's not just about memory or doing a motor task, it's about judgment, attention, and a sense of who the person is. These are all a bit flaky, and it has implications for recovery. So in addiction, we have excessive dopamine release, which causes desensitization or exhaustion of the reserves, and free dopamine damages nerve terminals, such as which happens in ice addiction. There are other effects of addiction. That is, the drug itself can actually be toxic to the frontal lobe, and this particularly occurs with alcohol or solvent sniffing. And then there's the whole series of things that occurs with addiction, along with addiction, such as head injuries, car accidents, assaults, strokes from high blood pressure, infections which can damage the brain, functionally psychosis, which is really like a computer being driven or the voltage turned up too much by overstimulation, causing circuits to sort of malfunction. And then there can be oxygen deprivation from overdose attempts or overdoses or suicide attempts. And in the case of cannabis and alcohol, the development of the frontal lobe can be impaired through cannabis and alcohol. And then there's pre-existing conditions which are often associated with substance use, such as ADHD, in which case there's about a 50% risk of developing a substance use problem later in life if not treated, and mental health issues where people are often tempted to self-medicate to feel better. So the smart brain and the animal brain, this picture just summarises, if you like, what happens: the smart brain in control, the animal brain in control. Who is at risk of addiction? Now, this is Barack Obama as a teenager, and obviously he didn't get addicted to cannabis, even though he's showing pretty signs of being a bit stoned here. So there are many reasons why people try substances. It can just be experimental risk-taking. Teens tend to be a bit rebellious. It's maybe very available. For example, alcohol. Peer group pressure. It's a social thing. It can be growing up in a culture where substance use is just the norm. So I've got a patient who's had his first cone when he was cannabis cone when he was 5, which is something that is quite abnormal, but in our sense, but in his culture, that was normal. There's a gateway effect that one substance tends to lead to another substance. There can be inadvertent exposure, such as having a broken leg and being given a painkiller that can then lead to addiction. And then there's vulnerable times when people say, well, what the hell, I want to feel better. People that can be driven to feel better. If there's a lot of depression, mental illness. So it's not a case of one thing will cause it. It's very much a balance. And if you had identical twins, there is an element of a genetics involved, and there's an element of nurture involved, and then there's an element of choice and exposure to the drug. So these are research, if you like, evidence-based data that are been proven to be associated with addiction. And childhood trauma and mental health issues are very important, as again, they don't directly lead to addiction, but they predispose. By childhood mental health, I'm talking about, say, anxiety disorders, Asperger's and ADHD. Childhood trauma, particularly sexual abuse of children, but domestic violence and that sort of thing. Disturbed parenting, where the parenting has been inadequate or not optimal, maybe caused by mental health issues of the parents, substance use in the parents, domestic violence, neglect. Again, I don't want anyone to feel that, though, if they know somebody or are the parent of anybody who is addiction, that they're directly responsible. These are statistical factors, and many factors lead to addiction. Mental health in adult is another factor. But the availability and type of addictive substances is a huge one. I mean, alcohol isn't a particularly addictive substance, but it is available widely and therefore is responsible for the biggest element of addiction in our society. Social integration and peer influence. If people are socially isolated or loners, if you like, they tend to be a greater risk of addiction. Peer influence is actually a protective factor, and it's not as big a concern as a lot of parents like to think. They think, well, I need to take my child out of that school and put them in a different school. In fact, if the child is a member of a peer group, that's likely to be protective. Even though that peer group may, say, use cannabis, they're likely to use cannabis within a certain range of use. The people that tend to go on to get addictive use of cannabis tend to be on the outer aspect of that peer group anyway. Genetics and epigenetics, I'll explain what that is later. Genetics is a big factor. So if there's a person with a substance use history, that has to be considered as a risk factor for that subsequent generation. Epigenetics is what happens to our genes as a result of our life, and certain genes are switched on and switched off. So even though a person may have, there may be no particular genes for addiction, the way genes are switched on and switched off by the parents' behaviour during their life may affect the risk of addiction in the subsequent generation. So it's really like a tug of war, and it's really a balance of factors. I guess I'm just coming to a point where to understand addiction, when we're dealing with a person who is suffering addiction, we'll often tend to come to some conclusion it's a disease, or it's this person's fault, or they're a failure, their moral strength is poor. There are incomplete models that we've used in the past, and I think that moral failure has been a big one. It tends to be the prevailing attitude in society that a person with addiction has got a character flaw. And that's simply an inadequate model to explain addiction. Given the circumstances relative to that person's decision to use substances, yes, they have made a decision to use substances, maybe no more drastic in the circumstances than some of the decisions we've made, which we're not happy with. So moral failure can't be sustained really. Disease is certainly, from what you've seen, the brain develops from its tendency to form habits and form behaviours. Substances hijack that system, so it can be considered as a disease, or at least a disorder of habit formation. And then the environmental exposure. So this is why we have laws to control alcohol availability and cigarettes, etc. Because simply put, if you or I were exposed to enough of a drug, we could become addicted. Social disadvantage is a factor, but it's definitely not the only factor. People from all walks of life can become addicted. Self-medication is a contributing factor. Some people use, particularly, say, opiates to relieve emotional pain of trauma. And it can be an accidental learning process where the person stumbles across a substance and it simply triggers a massive release of dopamine, and they have trouble unlearning. So we call this the biopsychosocial model, and it is the most complete, I guess, model of understanding addiction. And to modify, to treat somebody, we have to approach it from those different angles. There's also mentioning also that models of human need, this is one from 1945, Maslow. It's well known amongst people who've studied psychology or teaching, and it does have this factor in the top called self-actualisation, and I guess that is to do with what becomes the most important thing in people's lives, what provides meaning or purpose. And so I would add to that spiritual aspect, and many programs have have that aspect, such as AA or NA, the 12-step programs. So that's the end of this talk, and the next talk will be about specific substances. The next talk will be about amphetamines and ice, which is ice. And thank you for your attention, and hope that's been beneficial.